Hi everyone, and welcome to our Poll of Polls for the Friday the 13th series. We took a poll of all the rating lists we could find to determine the definitive ranking of the Friday the 13th films. So sit back, relax, and enjoy as we count down from the worst to the first. Now let's get things started.
Through a Voorhees may he be reborn, and only by the hands of a Voorhees will he die.
Number 12 on our list, Jason Goes to Hell, The Final Friday. This was New Line Cinema's first stab at the franchise, and the film in which Kane Hodder's appearance as Jason was almost as long as his cameo. Easily the worst entry on this list, and according to our poll of polls, by more than a country mile. The film gets itself off to an explosive start, but even then fans of the series felt disenchanted. Though he merely grunted, Jason was more vocal than he'd ever been before, and the opening lacked that Friday feel. With Jason's body literally obliterated, the direction of the story had instantly changed, and it was a direction that did not sit well with the franchise's loyal following. An ill-fated plotline featuring a prophecy and a mystic dagger turned this once-beloved series into an unwarranted fantasy that nobody had asked for. Sure, the gore was a welcome return, but this was a zombie flick that didn't require any ties to the franchise, but could also not garner any attention without it. Yes, the characters were memorable. We were introduced to Jason's stepsister, his niece, and her newborn daughter. We were also presented with a notable bounty hunter and a determined protagonist, but none of them were remotely likable. Clayton Duke took pleasure from breaking Stephen's fingers, and the chemistry between Stephen and Jessica was practically non-existent, and yet they walked arm in arm into the sunset by the film's end. Jason Goes to Hell was the only one of the series during the 90s. It would be another 8 years and a new millennium before we'd get the next chapter in the series. The film did tease the impending prospect of a Freddy vs. Jason feature for in the future, but that wouldn't surface for the better part of a decade. Number 11 on our list, Friday the 13th, Part 8, Jason Takes Manhattan. Thanks to an electrical surge, Jason is revived from his watery slumber after a houseboat drops anchor on Crystal Lake and pulls up a cable line. Jason soon boards the vessel and unceremoniously kills its love-making passengers before boarding a second, much larger ship bound for New York. This was the first film to attempt to take Jason away from Crystal Lake and place him into another setting. It was also Paramount's final feature in the series before passing the torch onto New Line Cinema. The filmmakers had clearly felt that the series had run its course over 7 films at the murderous summer camp and reasoned that it needed to be steered in a new direction. The title of the film, however, was misleading, as very little of it took place in the Big Apple. Surprisingly, the boat setting did fit well, but unfortunately, character development and plot seemed very much like an afterthought, and thus suffered greatly for it. This film is personally my least favorite in the series, and is a real long slog to get through, but not without some iconic moments, most of which came in the last 20 minutes of the movie. Jason on the train, Jason in Times Square, Jason's fight on the roof where Julius loses his head. These were all fine moments, but none of which could make up for the uninspiring story as part of a series that should have thrown in the towel before this entry.
Hey, you want a beer?
Or do you want to smoke some pot?
Number 10 on our list, Jason X. It may not have been the final frontier in regards to the longevity of the franchise, but it did take Jason somewhere no slasher had gone before. Evidently, the producers had decided that in order to bring Jason into the 21st century, he'd have to leave the previous century far, far behind. You know your series is on its last leg when you bring it into outer space. Yes, you heard it right. In this installment, Jason is cryogenically frozen and then thawed out many years later in the distant future. Naturally, he goes on a massive hacking spree and sets about killing a future generation of horny teenagers. Well, that's not entirely true. This film was the only film in the series to date that didn't have an R rating. It may have been lacking in sex and gore, but it didn't disappoint when it came to violence and action. With an exceedingly high kill count, New Line Cinema made up for the lack of Jason's presence in their last endeavor. Kane Hodder reprised his role for a fourth time, and Evil got an upgrade. The film doesn't take itself too seriously, but neither does its producers. It's very tongue-in-cheek, and sets resemble something more in line with a made-for-TV production than that of a theater release. It wasn't all bad. Hodder's performance as Cyber Jason was formidable, and the liquid nitrogen death scene was really cool.
For good!
Number 9 on our list, Freddy vs. Jason. This was the showdown fans of both franchises had eagerly awaited. The trouble was that it came about 6 or 7 years too late. Audiences had moved on. Japanese horror was at its peak, and even Wes Craven had elected to drop Krueger in favor of a modern twist on the slasher genre. The only thing that could revitalize these two icons would be a blockbuster of truly epic proportions. Unfortunately, it wasn't. The billing didn't match the hype, and there was no substance beyond the promise of the clash. The cast was always going to play second fiddle to the main attraction, but the characters were lifeless and utterly forgettable. It also felt more like a Freddy film than that of a Friday. Jason was Krueger's puppet for much of the film, and then was cast as the anti-hero when no longer in his control. On the plus side, Robert Englund reprised his role as the psychotic Dream Master, and was on his usual witty form. On the other hand, Hodder did not return to play Jason, and was instead replaced by Ken Kersinger, which did not meet with some fans' approval. The end clash was well executed, but everything before it was uninspiring. It was a must-see if you were a fan of both series, but a don't sweat it if you didn't. Oh, and for all you Krueger fans out there, Freddy lost. Number 8 on our list, Friday the 13th, Part 5, A New Beginning. Considering this film is so vilified by many fans, it's surprising to see this entry so high up the list. This was the first notable blip in the series. With Jason dead at the end of the previous movie, the aptly titled A New Beginning had the weighty task of restarting the franchise. However, to everyone's surprise, it seemed to be very much up to the challenge. It had an intriguing mystery at the heart of the story, a likable troubled protagonist in Tommy Jarvis, and a host of very memorable characters who seemed more than just fodder for the killer to get through. In all fairness, it was a pretty solid entry, apart from one crucial element. Have you ever been captivated by a great murder mystery, only to be utterly disappointed by its conclusion? A film that builds on the tension, makes you question whether he did it or didn't, only to discover that it was the paramedic you saw briefly at the start of the movie all along. Oh, wait a second. That was this movie. To make matters worse, it was also strongly suggested that Tommy would be the next killer in the series, the hero of this picture and the one prior. As I said, apart from this glaring oversight, this entry had memorable characters, great pacing, and a decent start. It just alienated its audience by teasing them with a film that revolved around Jason Voorhees, but with no Jason. Thankfully, the series got back on track with the next entry. 7 on our list, Friday the 13th, the 2009 reboot. Texas Chainsaw Massacre reboot, total flop. Nightmare on Elm Street reboot, total flop. Friday the 13th reboot. Well, it wasn't a classic, but it wasn't a total flop either. It was definitely the best of the three reboots, and the opening 20 minutes are arguably the best opening 20 minutes of any in the Friday series. Unfortunately, the pace wasn't sustainable. The beginning of the story borrowed from the first 4 Fridays, but once the source inspiration had ceased, the film had to rely on fresh material, which didn't offer anything new and wasn't anything special. It was a rehash, and some elements of the feature didn't sit well with older fans of the series. Jason now set traps, had a system of underground tunnels, and kept a girl prisoner instead of killing her outright. However, in spite of its shortcomings, it had plenty to praise. The film was gritty, and though the cast weren't any memorable than any before them, some of their deaths were. The iconic music and atmosphere had returned. It felt like a Friday, and the production level was the best we'd ever seen. In 2018, a new film in the series will hit our screens. This might not be down to the success of the 2009 reboot, but the reboot certainly didn't hinder the prospect of future entries. Number 6 on our list, Friday the 13th, Part 7, The New Blood. This film is about a girl with telekinetic ability who accidentally kills her father by the use of her powers as a child. Years later, she returns to the lake in an attempt to heal herself through the unorthodox methods of her therapist. After an incensed incident, she goes to the dock to bring back her father, only to unintentionally resurrect Jason. The cast of characters are your typical Friday stereotype. However, Melissa stands out as the jealous privileged rival to our girl-next-door protagonist Tina. Melissa continuously tries to get under Tina's skin and meets with a most satisfying and gruesome death at the hands of Jason. The standoff between Tina and Jason, using their combined supernatural abilities, is a real treat to watch, and the special effects, which were incredible at the time, still stand up well today. This film isn't without its flaws, however. One such flaw is when Maddie gets dolled up, then leaves the bedroom to go and find David, who's in the barn? This was Kane Hodder's first appearance as Jason, and he excels. The film also contains the infamous sleeping bag death, which is a fan favorite. This is my go-to film among the Fridays, and all in all is an enjoyable entry within the series. Number 5 on our list, Friday the 13th, Part 3, in 3D. Inherently, the third installment of any franchise is usually not that good. However, with the Friday series, this was not the case. It may not quite have been as good as the two before it, but it was still of decent standard. It had the gimmick of being filmed in 3D, but the effect was not the be-all and end-all of the movie. Yes, there were several shots that were specifically taken to play to the strengths of the cinematic spectacle, but the script had also been given equal consideration. The characters were well fleshed out, and the frightful tone had been maintained. In fact, this entry is so atmospheric, one could argue that it's the scariest in the series. The lone survivor, Chrissy, doesn't just simply escape her ordeal, she is greatly affected by it and comes away mentally scarred in spite of her victory. Of all the entries on this list, this film was the most divided among fans, fluctuating in position from pole to pole. This may be in due part to the fact that most fans have watched this in 2D as opposed to its intended format. It could also be as the result that the ending was so similar to the original film that it lost a degree of credibility. Regardless of its strengths and weaknesses, this was the film that introduced us to Jason's iconic mask, becoming so synonymous with the franchise it almost eclipsed the sport from which it came from, and will be forever remembered for it. Number 4 on our list, Friday the 13th, Part 2. How do you follow a classic original and create an enduring series? By making one hell of a great sequel. This film wasn't simply a copy of the first. It expanded on where the original left off, which included the cameo appearances of 2 previous survivors before killing them off and setting the tone that no one was truly safe. Part 2 had a wonderful set of characters, perfectly introduced with a memorable campfire scene, and we were presented with a brilliant protagonist in Ginny, who surpassed the repute of Alice and is arguably the greatest leading lady the series ever produced. If it wasn't praise enough, it also introduced its infamous antagonist, Jason Voorhees, spawning a renowned horror icon, be it without the hockey mask. As before, the cast were counselors, but the setting was different, and we were given a glimpse into the life and motivation of Jason through the creepy reveal of his hut in the woods. Where the inspiration of the first film had been taken from John Carpenter's Halloween, Part 2's ending was clearly derived from Norman Bates' relationship with his dead mother. However, the Friday sequel made for an unforgettable finale, so much so that the reboot drew inspiration from this interpretation as opposed to any of the others in the franchise. Number 3 on our list, Friday the 13th, Part 6. After leaving the audience feeling cheated by the Jason-less new beginning, the franchise had to reassure its fans that it could deliver on what they wanted, and thankfully they succeeded. The first assurance came from the title itself. The film would not feature anyone in the guise of our favorite serial killer other than Jason Voorhees. Tommy Jarvis returned for his third outing and seeks proof to confirm that Jason is dead by digging up his grave. In a tribute to Frankenstein, Jason is inadvertently resurrected by a bolt of lightning and recommences with his murderous quest as a hulking zombie. Horrified by the terror he has reawakened on Crystal Lake, Tommy sets out to right the wrong he has made and attempts to finish off Jason once and for all. Not the scariest in the series, but certainly entertaining, the director was given license to make light of the film, which is clearly evident from the upshot of the James Bond-style intro. However, in spite of its lighter tone, the movie was well scripted and provided many creepy scenes within its diverting storyline. Deaths were memorable, and the peril of Jason's presence among the campers was frightening. Ultimately, Tommy attains retribution, and the film's finale was a fitting conclusion to an immensely compelling movie.
We weren't doing anything. We were just messing around.
Number 2 on our list, Friday the 13th. Following the blueprint of John Carpenter's Halloween, Friday the 13th took the horror out of the suburbs and into the woods. It was also set as a murder mystery, with the audience never knowing the identity of the killer until the final 20 minutes. The cast of characters were all likable, despite being no more memorable than in any other horror movie. What sets it apart from other classics in the genre is its setting and backstory. A young child drowned as the result of counselor negligence, and someone is determined to make sure that the camp doesn't reopen. There's a really great feel of isolation at the camp, and the atmosphere is enhanced by the rural community that is opposed to the strangers disturbing its serenity. As expected, the acting for this kind of feature was hardly stellar. Its budget couldn't afford the high wages to attract any big names to the project, and Kevin Bacon was no A-lister at the time. However, it has to be said that Betsy Palmer's portrayal of Mrs. Voorhees is particularly chilling, and the gravitas of the whole film would not have been the same if it had been played by a lesser actress. As a film, it may not have aged well, but its finale and final jump scare are truly timeless. Number 1 on our list, Friday the 13th, the final chapter. It may not have been the final chapter in the series, but it was the best, and for good reason. Part 4 had everything that you could want in a Friday. A large cast for Jason to hack through? Check. Plenty of sex? Check. Great special effects? Check. The right atmosphere with scares and the right touch of humor? Check. This feature had it all, and then some. The film starts off where the third part had ended. The police clear up the massacre from the previous entry, and Jason's body is taken to the morgue. But, as you'd expect, he's not dead, and it doesn't take long for the homicidal maniac to get to work, killing everyone in his path on his way back to Crystal Lake. But what makes this film so good? For one, the cast are very memorable, and some of that can be attributed to the actors themselves. Sure, the series has had plenty of recognizable faces over the years, but none more so than in this entry. There was Crispin Glover of the Back to the Future, the girl from Weird Science, and of course Corey Feldman. He may be better known for his roles in The Goonies and Stand By Me, but it's fair to say that he may not have landed those roles if it had not have been for the astonishing performance he gives in this movie as Tommy. You can't have a great movie if it doesn't deliver at the end, and the ending is fantastic. Tommy shaves his head to distract Jason by assuming his likeness as a child before finishing him off in gruesome fashion. An entertaining watch from start to finish, and suitably the best of the entire series. Well, that concludes our list. I hope you enjoyed it. Now be careful when leaving the room, and we hope to see you during the next video. Until then, take care and have a good day.